G'day, mate. This is the Do and Teach Guy podcast. Quick disclaimer, everything I say is my opinion or interpretation only, and is based on my logic, research, and convictions. All scriptures are read from the New King James Version. So veg out and let's give it a bash. This is episode 19 and the last part of this mini-series on the law in the New Testament. God's full law. Let's pick up again in Romans chapter 3 verse 31. Do we then make void the law through faith? Certainly not. On the contrary, we establish the law. Pretty straightforward. Faith and the law work together and are not void. Romans 6 verses 1 and 2. What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Certainly not. How shall we, who died to sin, live any longer in it? Sinning is doing things against the law, as it mentions in 1 John 3, verse 4. Whoever commits sin also commits lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. This verse is on the list later on, so I will talk about it then. If we really died to sin through Jesus, then we should want to and actively try to not sin ever again. Of course, we will mess up occasionally, but that should be the exception and not the norm. Romans 6 verse 15. What then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law but under grace? Certainly not. No, we should not sin and assume God will continue to give His grace. And remember that the Bible's definition of sin is disobeying the law of God. Romans 7 verses 7 to 12, starting at 7. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Certainly not. On the contrary, I would not have known sin except through the law. For I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, "You shall not covet." The law lets us know what sin is. Simple. Disobeying the law is sin. A simple enough rule in word, but a little more tricky in deed, since our sin nature fights against us and tempts us to break the law. Verse 8. But sin, taking opportunity by the commandment, produced in me all manner of evil desire. For apart from the law, sin was dead. So his sinful nature urged him to sin, even before he knew what sin was. It's like a "don't touch wet paint" sign. All you want to do is touch it. Not the sign, the paint. You know what I mean. Verse 9. I was alive once without the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. For us, this means that before we heard the law, we were happily ignorant of our spiritual deadness. But when we came across the commandments, we realized that we were already dead. Verse 10. And the commandment, which was to bring life, I found to bring death. God gave us the commandments as an instruction book on how to live. All of them are designed to bring life. Disobeying them causes death, both while we are alive and permadeath later. Verse 11 to 12. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it killed me. Therefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good. So when he heard the commandment, he realized that sin tricked him into sinning. Then he realized how good the law is. Paul had a roundabout way of saying things, but he gets there in the end. You just have to read his entire thoughts. You can't just take out sections and assume that you know what he's getting at. He usually dances around a topic in a confusing way, which people take out of context a lot, but then he always sums it up clearly at the end, which parts are often left out with those who are trying to twist his words and justify their beliefs. Romans 7 verses 22 to 25. For I delight in the law of God according to the inward man, but I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind, and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin which is in my members. O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? I thank God, through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, with the mind I myself serve the law of God, but with the flesh the law of sin. So basically he doesn't want to sin, but his sinful nature sometimes causes him to mess up every now and then. I sure know how that feels, but the important part is that he's trying to obey God's laws. 1 Corinthians 5 verse 8. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Here he straight out says it. Let us keep the feast of unleavened bread. New Testament, after Jesus died. How much clearer does he need to be? But he adds that he is urging people to keep it like Jesus did, with love and kindness, not just by doing the minimum that the law requires. 1 Corinthians 7 verse 19. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. This is much like a previous verse saying, if you are circumcised and don't keep the law, you're out, and if you're not snipped but do keep the law, you're in. Trying to keep the law is the important part. You're not just automatically in because your parents obeyed the law when you were 8 days old. 1 Corinthians 9 verses 20 and 21. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, not being without law towards God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. Meaning, when he was around Jews, he acted like a Jew, doing all the extra stuff that was unnecessary, but didn't contradict God's law, like washing his hands in the right way before eating. That way they would respect him and listen to him more. Likewise, when he was with Gentiles, he would not do that extra Jewish stuff, but just preached and obeyed God's actual law. Galatians 2 verses 3 and 4. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. And this occurred because of false brethren secretly brought in, who came in by stealth to spy out the liberty which we have in Jesus Christ, that they might bring us into bondage. This is another classic Pharisee move, planting fake believers into the disciples of Jesus, who were trying to convince the people that they needed to be circumcised in order to be saved, and trying to lure them back into the bondage of the Jewish made-up rules. but they obviously weren't doing a great job because Titus, who was not snipped, wasn't convinced that circumcision was necessary for salvation. You may be a bit confused about this whole circumcised or not thing. It's one of those things that people vary on considerably, but as I see it, at the time of recording this, no, you don't need to be circumcised to be accepted by God into everlasting life. However, there is nothing wrong with getting circumcised if you want to, but it's not commanded for converts. Sort of. However, if you become a follower of God and then have a baby boy, you should follow the commandment of snipping him on the 8th day as instructed by the law. Galatians 5, verse 11. And I, brethren, if I still preach circumcision, why do I still suffer persecution? Then the offence of the cross has ceased. This bit is pretty funny. He's complaining that he still preaches that the Gentiles need to circumcise their children, and that the Gentile converts can get snipped. Yet the Jews are still attacking him, and saying he's preaching against circumcision. Colossians 2, verses 16 and 17. So let no one judge you in food or in drink, or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. This is another verse that the modern Christians flip over 180 degrees. They say don't let people judge you for not eating clean or obeying the Sabbath, but the opposite is true, as is made clear by reading the previous verse, which shows that this is talking about not letting your pagan friends judge you and tricking you out of obeying God's laws after you're converted. Also, the shadow of things to come clearly shows the stuff is not irrelevant because it is pointing towards things that have not happened yet. Obeying them reminds us of and points us to what we have to look forward to in the age to come. There are a couple of translations out there that say shadows of things that were to come. This requires time to explain that I don't really want to allocate, so you can look it up yourself. But in summary, it's effectively saying the same thing. Both say that the shadows are pointing to Jesus and his work on the cross and his second coming. Colossians 3 verse 5. Therefore, put to death your members which are on the earth: fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. This verse and the next one are really only here because it mentions uncleanness. This is a whole topic that is regrettably ignored by the modern Christians. I will probably talk about this more in another episode, but basically, since the word unclean has a bad reputation in our society today, I suggest we replace the words relating to unclean in our heads with something like tainted or unsanitary. Being unsanitary is not a state you want to stay in if you can help it. The laws of uncleanness were given to help prevent disease and stuff. Thus, if ignored, tends to bring curses on you, like the Bible warns. The point is, the New Testament, after Jesus has died, mentions about uncleanness and it being bad. Therefore, it is still relevant and shouldn't be ignored. 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 7. For God did not call us to uncleanness, but in holiness. This passage suggests that uncleanness is the opposite to holiness, so it would make sense to try and avoid being unclean and trying to be holy. So being unclean is bad. Things like touching a dead body. There is a reason why morticians wear gloves when handling bodies. But I will talk about that in another episode. 2 Timothy 3, verse 16. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God, and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. When this was written, all Scriptures referred to the Old Testament only, because the New Testament wasn't really written yet. So all the Old Testament is good doctrine. But even if some of the New Testament was around, none of it contradicts the Old Testament. It just helps explain it. Because as I've said before, the New Testament is just a commentary on the Old Testament. Hebrews 10 verses 26 to 28. For if we sin willfully after we have received the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a certain fearful expectation of judgment, and fiery indignation, which will devour the adversaries. Anyone who has rejected Moses' law dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. That last verse just hit a home run. It clearly says anyone who rejects Moses' law dies without mercy. Still think Moses' law doesn't apply to you? Just in case you're a bit confused about the last bit of the verse, the dying without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, this is referring to God's mercy and forgiveness. I think the 2 or 3 witnesses thing is just an expression, since it's taken out of God's law. A lot of the New Testament has many quotes from the Old Testament, which turned into cultural sayings amongst the Jews. 1 John 2, verses 3 and 4. Now by this we know that we know him, if we keep his commandments. He who says, I know him, and does not keep his commandments, is a liar, and the truth is not in him. His commandments are God's commandments. Unless you think it means Jesus' commandments, well, you would be right there too. They are both the same. Jesus and God are one. They both have the same rules and commandments. What's that? You are reminded of where Jesus says that he has a new commandment for us? Good memory. You're thinking of John 13, verse 34. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, as I have loved you, that you also love one another. The new commandment is to love others like Jesus loved others, and Jesus loved others according to the commandments of God, to their full extent. Jesus is our example on how to live, and how to obey the meaning of the laws, not just the letter of the laws. So effectively Jesus is saying, follow God's commandments the way I did, with love. So it's not actually a new commandment, it's just a new way of thinking about the commandments. 1 John 3 verse 4. Whoever commits sin also commits lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. Here is that promised verse. Sin is lawlessness. Sin is doing things outside of the law of God. It doesn't get much clearer than that one. 1 John 3 verses 22 and 23. And whatever we ask, we receive from him, because we keep his commandments and do those things that are pleasing in his sight. And this is his commandment, that we should believe on the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another, as he gave us commandment. This says that God's commands are to love Jesus and obey God's commands like Jesus did, and that obeying God's commands are pleasing to God. 1 John 5 verses 2 and 3. By this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and keep his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. How straightforward can you get? How can people say the law is a burden after reading this gem of a verse? And how can modern Christianity say that people don't have to try and keep the commandments? It doesn't make sense. 2 John 1 verse 6. This is love, that we walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment, that as you have heard from the beginning, you should walk in it. Another super clear one. This is the commandment that you've heard from the beginning, meaning it's not a new one. It's the same commandments that have been followed for thousands of years before Jesus, and should be followed thousands of years after Jesus. It's straight out telling us to obey God's laws that were given to Moses. And obeying God's commandments is a major part on how God wants to be loved. All the commandments are focused on love. We love God by not worshipping other gods and keeping his Sabbaths and holy days. Likewise, it tells us that not stealing from people and coveting them is how we love them. Now on to the last one, Revelation 22 verse 14. Blessed are those who do his commandments, that they may have the right to the tree of life, and may enter through the gates into the city. The city he's referring to is the New Jerusalem, just so you know. But he says, blessed are those who do his commandments. Do you want to be blessed? There are a bunch of verses in Revelation that say that the ones who follow the commandments and believe in Jesus are persecuted, but you can look them up for yourself if you want. Conclusion. Once you see all these verses that you thought said one thing and find out that they might be saying the opposite thing, it's hard to ignore that nagging feeling in your conscience that says, what if I was wrong about the law of God being abolished? What if there's a way that I can live my life that's more pleasing to God? Think on it and pray about it. Then you might eventually start coming to the same conclusion that millions of others have come to over the last 15 odd years, and a new spark of love for God and his word will kindle in you. There is a movement happening, because God is trying to draw his people closer to him, because the end is coming soon. And yes, I know people have been saying that for thousands of years, but now it's even sooner. These last 3 episodes were not an in-depth study on each of these passages. There are tons of other resources on the internet to dive into deeper if you want to. Fun times ahead. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. I pray that your faith grows, but more importantly, that it's shown through your life and your actions. Catch ya.